Welcome to part 15 of this series on Excel VBA user forms. This video is going to explain how to use tab strip controls, and we'll start as ever by showing you how to draw a tab strip on a form, and we'll explain how to add and organize the tabs, including a bit about how to format them as well. We'll explain how you draw controls on a tab and how those controls interact with the different tabs in the tab strip. And towards the end of the video we'll explain how you can loop over the tabs collection of a tab strip and how to loop over the controls in the tab. So a few things to do here, let's get started. Here's our basic example of a tab strip control. The simple idea is that when I click onto a different tab, it reads in the relevant set of details from the underlying worksheet. So each tab I click on will change the values stored in the text boxes. When I click on the total tab, it simply sums the values in each column. So it's not a massively complicated example to create, but it's enough to demonstrate how tab strips work. So let's get stuck in. Just before we create the form, there's a little bit of work to do in the workbook itself. I've created a new worksheet, which I've called Revenue, and then on the worksheet I've created a simple table of data with some imaginary made-up figures representing sales for different categories. So I've got tickets, Blu-ray DVD, digital media, and merchandise. The really important thing is that I've got three separate rows, one for each of three different regions. The names you enter into these cells here are going to be used by the tab strip to work out which set of data to load. So we're going to be referring back to these cells a bit later on. The figures themselves, it really doesn't matter, I just made these up completely, so you can enter whatever figures here you like. I've also just made sure that if I go back to the Visual Basic Editor that I've given this worksheet a code name as well, so I've called it WS Revenue. So if you've got all that set up, we can actually go about creating the form itself. Let's start by inserting a new form into the project. So we can do that by right-clicking somewhere into the Project Explorer and choosing Insert User Form. And let's change a couple of the form's basic properties. So we'll change its name first of all. So I'm going to call this one Film Revenue. And then we'll change its caption as well, so that says something similar, Film Revenue. Next we can draw the tab strip control on the form. So let's click once on the form's background to show the toolbox, and you'll find the tab strip control sitting right next door to the multi-page. Try not to get the two confused because the icons do look very similar, but the two controls work in very different ways. So let's click the tab strip control and then click once on the form to draw it, and we'll change its name so that it's called something sensible. Let's call this one Film Revenue Tabs. A tab strip comes along with two tabs by default, but we need 4 to make this example work, so let's insert a couple more. Inserting tabs should be a simple case of right-clicking onto the tab strip and then choosing to insert new pages, but you have to be slightly careful about how you've got the tab strip selected. If I just click away from it first of all, if I click once on the tab strip and then choose to right-click, I don't get any options to insert a new page. If I click away and then click once on it and then once on it again, you'll see the border shading changes. And if I've done this now, I can right-click and choose to insert a new page. So the way you select the tab strip is quite important. So I'm going to right-click again and choose to insert one more page. So I've got 4 altogether, and I can switch between them just by clicking on them. The next thing I need to do is rename the individual tabs, or at least change their captions. Now, somewhat unusually, if you've used a multi-page control, you'll be familiar with selecting a separate page and then seeing its properties appear in the properties window. But that doesn't work with a tab strip. These aren't really considered to be individual objects. You've got one single tab strip object. If I want to modify the captions of the different tabs, what I have to do is right-click on them and then choose to rename them. This isn't actually going to change its name, they don't actually have a separate name property, but what it will do is change the caption. So let's change these so that they relate to the different regions we're going to be using. So I'm going to call this one USA. I'm going to take care here, by the way, to make sure that the names or the captions I'm using match exactly the names of the regions in the worksheet. So I've got USA, UK, and then World, and then the last one is going to be Total. Okay, so those are our 4 tabs renamed, ready to accept some controls. Just before we add some controls to the tab strip, it's worthwhile mentioning a few of its basic formatting properties. So very similar to a multi-page control, you can modify the style of the tabs with the style property. So they're styled as tabs by default. You can also change them so that they're buttons, and you can also turn them off altogether as well, so you can say no tab strip at all. I'm going to go back to the original tab style for this. This is how this example is going to work. You can also modify the orientation of the tabs, so you don't have to set them across the top of the tab strip. You can modify them so they sit along the left hand side or the right hand side, etc., just by modifying the tab orientation property. Again, I'm going to set mine back up at the top. I think it makes the most sense for this particular example. You can set a fixed width for the tab strips as well, so you may notice that when I change the names or the captions on the tabs, they change their width to match the width of the text. But if you wanted to set a fixed width so that they were all a consistent width, you can modify the tab fixed width property. So I set that to something, I don't know, let's say 30, and then hit enter. I'll get all the tabs being the exact same width. I'm going to change that back to it so it's dynamic, and I can do that by entering a 0 for the fixed width property. You can also change the back color of the tab strip in a similar sort of way to the way multi-page controls work, though. That only changes the background color of the tab part itself. It doesn't change the background color of the page. So just like with a multi-page control, the only way to change the background color of your tab strip is really to change your Windows themes colors. So it uses the default button face color by default. You could always draw a frame control on the background of your tab strip if you wanted to, so like we did with the multi-page in the previous video. I could draw a frame and then change the frame's background color so that, that matches the colors that I want, but I'm not going to bother doing that in this particular example. I'm just going to change its background color back to the original default button face color, and then we'll start adding some controls to the tab strip to display some values. We need to draw 4 separate labels and 4 text boxes to represent the 4 different categories of revenue for our films. I'm going to start by increasing the size of my tab strip control first, though, so that I can have enough space to draw all these controls. And then we can draw, let's start by adding the 4 labels. So I'm going to double click the label tool on the toolbox, and then I can draw 4 labels, 1, 2, 3, 4. Go back to the select objects tool. One slightly odd thing about the way tab strips work, particularly if you're coming from using multi-page controls, if you're expecting them to work in the same way, there's something very strange about the way tab strips work with the controls you've drawn on them. These controls don't actually belong to a separate page or even to the tab strip at all. If I click onto the page UK or World or Total, you'll see the labels remain visible. If this was on a multi-page control, those labels would only appear if I was on the USA page. The other thing that would happen as well with the multi-page control would be that if I've moved the multi-page control around on the form, the controls drawn inside it would go with it. If I do that with a tab strip control, the labels don't move. So when you draw controls on a tab strip, they don't actually belong to the tab strip itself. The controls are just drawn on top of it, so they're layered in the vertical layer of the form, or the Z axis of the form, if that makes sense. So you don't draw separate sets of controls for each different page. You just draw one set of controls that's replicated on each page as you navigate to them. So I've got my 4 labels drawn. Let's just change their captions so they say something sensible. So we can have 4 different categories of information. Let's call this one tickets. I'm not going to bother changing the label names because I'm not going to reference these in code for this particular video. I'll call this one DVD and Blu-ray. And then let's have the 3rd label, that will be digital. And then the 4th one will be merchandise. We'll also need to have 4 text boxes that can display the values. So let's have 4 text boxes. I'll double click the text box tool and then just draw 1, 2, 3, 4 nice and quickly. And then we can rename each one of these. So I'm going to change the name of the first one so that it's called Rev Tickets. And then the second one will be Rev DVD, and the 3rd one, Rev Digital. You've probably got the idea by now. And then the last one will be called Rev Merchandise. Okay, so those are all the controls drawn. I could do with a little bit of tidying up. I'm not going to spend too long doing this actually, but feel free to use all the tools you know about from previous videos to make this layout nice and neat. What we want to do next is start adding some code so that when this form is displayed and when we navigate to the different tabs, the text boxes will display the values from the appropriate row on the worksheet. Let's start by adding some code to the form's initialize event so that when the form runs, it always has the USA tab selected by default. Just to show you why we're doing this in the first place. When you design the form, if you had a separate tab selected, the next time you run it, it will start with that tab selected. The reason this happens is because of the value property of the tab strip control. So if I select the tab strip and look in the properties window, it has got a value property, and that value property changes based on which tab I select. Since if I select UK, it goes to 1, if I select USA, it goes to 0. So basically there's a zero-based index of the tabs in a tab strip. So I want to make sure that when I first run the form, the value of the tab strip is set to 0. So what we're going to do is double click on the background of the form to give us the click event of that form, and then I'll just use the drop down list at the top right hand corner to choose the initialize event, and then change the or delete the click event altogether. We don't need that. And then a simple little bit of code here that's going to set film revenue tabs dot value equal to 0. So if I go back to the form itself in the design view or the object view, and then it doesn't matter what tab I have selected in design view at this point, when I run the form, it will always make sure it goes back to the USA tab first. So that's nice and simple to do. Now we need to go back to the code view of the form and start adding some more code so that it will change the values of the text boxes. As we're going to be doing this in a couple of different places in the form, it makes sense to declare a separate procedure that we can call. So let's create a new private sub, which we're going to call update revenue. The first thing we'll do in here is declare a variable that can hold a reference to a range object. So I'm going to say dim r as range. And what we're going to use that object for is to store a reference to the range that matches the name of the tab that I've currently got selected on the tab strip, which sounds a bit of a mouthful to say out loud, but what we're going to do is this: set r equal to ws revenue dot columns A. I'll make this as short as I possibly can, so I'm going to look in the entirety of column A. I'm going to attempt to find. What I'm trying to find is the caption of the selected tab on the tab strip. So the tab strip is called Film Revenue Tabs. There's a property called Selected Item, which refers to whichever tab you've got selected. And then I can refer to the caption property of that to return the text stored in the caption of the tab. Now that I have a reference to that cell, I can start updating the values of the text boxes. So I should be able to say things like rev tickets dot value is equal to r.offset 0, 1 dot value. So the value of the ticket sales is one column to the right of the region name. Very similarly, I can then say rev DVD dot value equals r.offset 0, 2 dot value. And in fact, for the next two, I'm just going to copy and paste, which isn't really cheating if it speeds things up. So rev DVD is 2 columns across, then it was digital, which was 3 columns across, and merchandise that was 2 columns across. So let's just update these. That's rev digital, and the last one is rev DVD. Rev merchandise. Okay, so those 4 text boxes should now have their values changed. Last job is to call this procedure when the form is initialized. So let's have a new line in the initialize event, which is going to say call update revenue. Again, the call keyword is optional. I keep on mentioning this. It's entirely up to you whether you put the call keyword in or not. So let's give this one a quick simple test. If I just head back to the form in its design view or object view, click on its background and choose to run the form, we should find that when the form first loads, it points to the USA page and loads the values for the USA. So currently this only works when the form first loads. If I switch to the different tabs, nothing happens at all to the text box's values. So remember that these are essentially the same text box displayed on each separate tab. These aren't separate objects on the different tabs. So what we need to do now is make sure that when we switch between the different tabs, it updates the text box's values. So let's close the form down and get back to the code view behind the form, so I can just double click on the form. And the event that I want to use this time is the change event of the tab strip. So I can use the drop down list at the top to choose my film revenue tabs control, and that gives me the change event, which is the default event. Again, all the other events of the object are available in the drop down list at the top right. And all we're going to do here is, well, basically call the update revenue routine again. So nothing too difficult here at all. If I then go back to the object view, click on the background of the form and then choose to run it, this time when I switch between the different tabs, UK, World and USA, it all updates normally. We do have a small issue if we try to click onto the total tab. So although the UK and World and USA regions have got entries in this list, these bits of text match exactly. If I were to click on the total tab, it will crash. And the reason it crashes is because there is no range that has the word total in it in column A on the revenue sheet. So I'm going to click I hit the debug button. It will fail on this line trying to offset from a cell which doesn't exist essentially. So I'm going to hit the reset button to stop running that code and then get back to the code view and add a really simple instruction in the update revenue routine. We're going to say if R is nothing, then exit sub. So that'll be fairly straightforward. What we can then do is give this one a quick test. And if I go back to, back to the Visual Basic Editor, go back to the design view of the form first, and then run the form. This time if I switch between the different tabs, it all works, but if I click on the total tab, nothing happens. It might make more sense that if I click onto a tab that doesn't have an entry in the worksheet, for it to clear out the contents of all the existing text boxes. So rather than just leaving it with the last values that were displayed, it should clear the contents of those. So let's add a bit of code that will do that. I'm going to close down the form and then go back to the code view and back into the update revenue procedure. Now we could do this in a fairly basic way by writing a separate instruction for each individual text box and just set its value back to an empty string or the value 0. But then if we have to add in a whole bunch more text boxes of the form later on, that means we've got to modify the code. So it might make a bit more sense just to loop over the text boxes on the form. So what I'm going to do is declare a new variable called dimctl as an msforms.control. And what we're going to do then inside this if statement is, rather than just exiting the sub, we will still exit the sub, but only at the end of the if statement this time. So I'm just going to rearrange this so we've got a block if. And then inside here, if we haven't found a cell, we're going to loop over the controls on the form. So we're going to say for each CTL in controls. So that will loop over the controls collection of the entire form. I'll add in the next CTL line. And then inside that loop, we're going to test if type of CTL is an msforms.textbox. Then add in my end if. If that happens to be true, I will just want to change its value back to an empty string. So I'm going to say CTL.value equals an empty string. Then the subroutine will exit, so it won't then try to update the values of the text boxes. Just to give that one a quick test then, back into Excel, back to the Visual Basic Editor, back to the design view of the form, and then run the form. And if I click between the different tabs, that will all work. If I click onto the total tab, it will clear the contents of all of the text boxes. One quick additional thing to do here, rather than just displaying the raw values of the cells into the text boxes, it might be nice to have these formatted with some kind of currency symbol and some commas to separate the units of thousands. So just to add in a quick little tiny extra bit of code here, if I just close the form down and then go back to the code behind the update revenue procedure, rather than just display the raw value of the cell, we're going to apply the format function to that. So I'm going to say format the value of the cell with, let's have this format. I'm going to say $, hash, comma, hash, hash, 0. Okay, so you enter the formats as a string of text. We've used this in a couple of the previous videos in this series, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. So let's say format, I'll offset 0.2.value, comma, I should have just copied and pasted this, shouldn't I? So $, hash, comma, hash, hash, 0. In fact, let's copy and paste that for the next two. Then I can just update the offset. So I'm offsetting 3 columns across here, and then again copy and paste that, and then 4 columns across for that one. Okay, so having done that, just a last quick little test. If I go back to the design view of the form and then run that, and I should find now that I get the nicely formatted versions of the values of the cells rather than just the raw numbers. Okay, so the last major thing we have to get working is clicking on the Total tab to display the total values for each category of sales. There are several different ways I could get this to work, and the simplest by far would just be to apply a sum function to the column of values for each different category. But I wanted to do this in a slightly different way to demonstrate how to loop over the tab or tabs collection in a tab strip. So what we're going to do is loop over each individual tab, and for each one of these, find the appropriate value for each category and accumulate its value into a variable, and then finally display the total value on the when we click onto the total tab. So I'm going to close down the form, head back to the VBA editor, go back to the code view of the form simply by double clicking on its background, and then again we're going to have a separate subroutine for this one altogether. So let's create a separate sub down towards the bottom. We'll call private sub calculate total. We'll need a few different variables to get this example to work, but the primary one, as I'm going to be looping over the collection of tabs in the tab strip, I'll need to declare a variable which I'm going to call t as an msforms.tab. We're also going to have a variable that I'm going to call dim r as range, so that we can find the cell containing the appropriate region, and then a whole bunch of variables that we're just going to use to accumulate the totals for each different category. So I'm going to say dim, I'm just going to call it ticket total as double. I'm going to declare a few of these on the same line, and we'll have DVD total, DVD total as double, and then another comma, and we'll have digital total, spell that properly, digital total as double, and then finally we will have merchandise total, or I'm just going to call it in fact merch total as double. Okay, having done all that, just give myself a bit more space so we can see this a bit more clearly. The next job is to start looping over the tabs collection. This is just a simple for each loop. So in this case, we're going to say for each t in, and then we can reference the tab strip, which is film and revenue tabs, and then refer to its tabs property, which refers to the collection of all the tabs. A couple of blank lines and say next t. Now, for each one of the tabs that we go to, we want to find the appropriate row in the worksheet and accumulate its total. But we want to exclude the total tab from that loop. So we're going to have an if statement here that's going to say if t.caption is not equal to total, then we're going to start accumulating its value. Make sure we have the end if. So inside here we're going to look for the appropriate cell. So we're going to use the same technique we used previously. We're going to say set r equals ws revenue dot columns a dot find, and then in the find method we're going to pass in the value of the caption of the tab. So we're going to say t dot caption. So assuming that we found a cell, now we should have found a cell because the tab names of our tab strip match up with the names as they're entered into the worksheet, but just in case we should have an if statement here that says if not r is nothing, then. So we're only going to do this if we have successfully found a cell, and as long as that's the case, we're simply going to start accumulating the values in each of these variables. So it's going to be ticket total equals ticket total plus r.offset 0,1 dot value. The other three are pretty much the same thing, so it might be worthwhile just quickly copying and pasting that line there 3 times, and then just quickly updating these. So we're going to go for DVD total equals DVD total, and then digital total equals digital total. I should give them shorter names, and then I've got merch total, and that's equal to merch total. And it also needs to update the offsets here as well. So rather than offset 1 each time, it's offset 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so once we finish looping, we can then just pass the values back out of those variables and store them in the values of the text boxes on the form. Probably the simplest thing to do here is just cheat and copy and paste those 4 lines from our previous routine. And then we can simply update the values that we're passing in. So rather than the value of the cell, we're going to go for ticket total. And then we'll have the DVD total. Let's just do a bit more copy and paste just to save a bit of time. Sorry, this is quite boring, this part. And then digital total. And then finally the merch total. The last thing we really need to do now is make sure that we call this procedure at the appropriate time. So let's scroll back up to the change event of the tab strip, and we'll add an if statement here that's going to say if film revenue tabs dot selected item dot caption equals total, then. If that's the case, then we're going to call the calculate total procedure, the one we just finished writing. Otherwise, we're just going to call the original one, the update revenue. Don't forget the end if, and then we should be able to give this one a quick test now by going back to the forms design view and then running it. And if we switch between the different tabs, including the total tab this time, we just get the total value of each column. So there's the basics of how the tab strip works. Just to wrap up this example, we're going to create a better way to display the form on screen. So I'm going to close the form down, and just as we've done for the previous form that we've created in this series, we're going to add a button to the menu sheet that's going to let us launch the form. So I'm going to start by inserting an ActiveX control, and we're going to draw another button on here. I'm going to display the properties window so I can change a few of its basic properties. I'm going to change its name so it's called something like Show Film Revenue Form. And then we'll also change its caption. I'll call this Film Revenue, something simple like that. And then I want to add some code to the click event of that button. So the simplest thing to do here is just to double click the button to get to the code view. So in a similar way to the way we've loaded and then displayed the film details form in the previous example, we're going to say load film revenue and then film revenue dot show. I mentioned in the previous video where we talked about this, you don't have to apply the load method or use the load method. That will happen implicitly when you try to show the form on screen. The reason you might want to separate out the two events is if you wanted to do something in between loading the form into memory and then finally displaying it. So you might want to populate some boxes or some text boxes or do some other things before you finally show the form on screen. Anyway, having done all that, I'm going to go back to Excel. And then I'm going to exit design mode by clicking the design mode button, and clicking the film revenue button will display the form on screen. I don't need to have the revenue sheet selected for this to work. Based on the way the find method works, it can find cells, so it doesn't have to select anything. So all that can happen without having that worksheet selected, and everything just works. So it's not a particularly complicated example, but hopefully it's just enough to give you the basic idea of how tab strips work. Hope you've enjoyed that one. Join us for the next video. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseL website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.